so many good things to say about Tom. I think I've known him for 30 years. I was counting back, and I think that's when you did the article regarding the snowfall. And Trisha's little girl had the front page of of the Itemizer Observer, and it was just incredible for the child and her family. She's a senior at Portland State now in psychology. So Tom creates miracles with what he writes and how he supports people. I sent you his bio, and you have read. He's received over 100 awards and recognition. Um, but the person that he holds dearest in his life, he will write to as well, and that is his wife, as well as his son and daughter. Probably, I know more about Sam. Anyway, please welcome Tom Henderson.
Thank you. And like I said, I'm going to have to be honest now. I can't tell fish stories because Dave's in the room, and yeah, he knows he knows the entire history. So you can rest assured that this is not any sort of embellishment. But, I actually was going to present myself as something of the institutional memory of the Itemizer Observer, but again, that's out the window too. Dave Preston, that Dave's association with the paper goes back farther than mine, but mine goes back 40 years to 1980 when I was a senior at South Salem High School, and we would come over every other week and paste up the newspaper at the Itemizer Observer.
Yeah.
And so in many ways, it was the first real professional newsroom that I ever saw. And it was quite the same building, but a very different newspaper back then. I remember walking through, and they had Smith Corona typewriters, I believe. And every station had a typewriter. And there was that familiar clacking noise as you walked through the newsroom back to what is now, I believe, display advertising, but was then had a giant machine called a Unicenter, where you would run out stories on strips of photographic paper and apply melted wax to them and cut them apart with X-Acto knives. And so my first lessons in how to lay out a newspaper were learned at the Itemizer Observer in 1980. And then when I started college at Western Oregon, and one of the first things I did there was I made connection with the Monmouth-Independence Sun Enterprise and Herb Sweat. This was back when the Sun Enterprise was located, I think it's the insurance office now that's next to Mendy's Pizza, but right there on the S curve. I did a story about a Western alum whose name I can't even remember. Actually, Kirk Matthews from Channel 6. He was an anchorman. I did a story on him, and Herb Sweat bought it for something like 50 cents a column inch, and one of my first big paydays. And Herb is still around. Herb is now writing copy for a newsletter in Willamina. But he still covers athletic events and local news. And so Herb is still going at it, speaks at every opportunity to journalism students, and is still a force in the industry. So, and then I actually, my first recollection of Dave was in 1984 when I was seeking an internship at the Itemizer. At the time, the editor at the time was Dick Clark, and Dick was just leaving the Itemizer to go to the Woodward Independent. And I didn't drive at the time, so Dave drove all the way to Salem and met me at the Great Harvest Bread Company at the former Candelaria Terrace, and set me up with the internship. And so that was Steve Johnson was the editor, and Leslie Glow was the reporter, and Jim Lund was the sports editor during that summer at the Itemizer, where I covered the Polk County Fair, and learned extensively under Dave's tutelage. And then I returned in it must have been 1994. I had gone on to become a reporter and then later editor of the Woodward Independent, and had got married to my feature editor, who then took a job at the Itemizer Observer, first as a part-time sports writer, and later she, Virginia, became the editor of the paper, and then I worked for her as the editor, or as a reporter. And back then, again, a very different paper. There was a Monmouth-Independence bureau at that time. There was what is a little strip of offices at Rincon Reforestation, served as the Independence office of the paper, and I worked there with the late great John Oliver. And John Oliver and I held forth at the Monmouth-Independence office with Sharon Collinsworth as our receptionist, just the three of us. And Sharon was wonderful. If anyone had the misfortune of coming into the paper to complain that the coverage was lopsided, Monmouth-Independence wasn't getting enough coverage, I had seen Sharon take people by the ear. She would grab them by the ear and take them over to the stack of newspapers and make them count how many stories were from Dallas and how many stories were from Monmouth-Independence. And she would prove for them. She would make them take a count with a notepad, and she would always prove that there were exactly as many Monmouth-Independence stories as there were Dallas stories. And that was a great time. I remember John Poff came in with a baseball that had a mushroom growing out of it. And we had gotten so many weird vegetables that year that we started the weird vegetable contest. That everyone brought in their weird vegetables at one point in the year. I think John won, despite heavy competition from a gourd that looked like Spiro Agnew. But it was, and just, like I said, just a remarkable time. And then in 2001, right after the Sunday before the attacks of 9/11, Virginia left the paper, left as editor, and her last day was Tuesday, the Tuesday of the attacks. And she had worked all day getting the paper ready because she didn't really work a lot of time there, Tuesday being her last. But and so the paper was all put together by the time the attacks came. We were the only weekly newspaper in Oregon. Most weekly newspapers in Oregon go to press on Tuesday mornings. Our press deadline to this day remains Tuesday at noon. And that's when you absolutely have to get the paper to the press. But that morning, we were the only weekly newspaper in the state of Oregon to cover the attacks of 9/11 as they were happening. We broke down the entire paper. Daniel Hurst, a photographer, and I went out and got local reaction. Daniel got a picture of the flag being lowered to half-mast at Dallas High School. I ran around and got local reaction. Justin Carenzi, one of our reporters, contacted a terrorism expert at PSU to assess the threat of terrorism, further terrorism attacks in small communities like ours. We ran an editorial on the front page that jumped to our editorial page. And I'm very proud of that editorial. It stands the test of time. It talks a lot about who we are as a people, how we will not let this change who we are as a nation, that we will respond to these attacks with more justice and mercy than was shown us, and that is right and proper. And there's a call for both the reaction, but also for calm. I think it's a wonderful editorial. If you ever get a chance to look it up, it's a proud moment. And every other weekly newspaper in the state led with stories about whatever they had planned about local city councils and planning commissions and school boards. But very proud that we were the only weekly paper to localize that story. And it was still a very Polk County story. If we provided a snapshot of what life in Polk County was like on that morning. And then a few months thereafter, I became managing editor of the paper, and Nancy Adams, who was the publisher at the time, stepped down, and we were fortunate enough to get Dave back. Dave became our editor and publisher again, and the paper went from it had become a tabloid during Nancy's time at the paper, and Dave reinvigorated it as a regular broadsheet newspaper. And again, back then we had 7 people on the news staff. I counted out the other day. We had 7 people. We had 2 Dallas reporters, 2 Monmouth-Independence reporters in their own bureau office. We had a sports editor, a community editor, myself, and then a photographer, and then we usually had 1 or 2 part-time interns and so forth. But that is remarkable for a paper this size to have 7 people on the news staff. And Dave came in with one of the more ambitious things that he did was we had 2 editions every week. We had a Monmouth-Independence edition and a Dallas edition. We flip-flopped the front page. We had Dallas stories on the front page. We swapped those out and put in Monmouth-Independence stories. And then we put the Dallas stories back further in the paper. or for the Dallas edition, we did the Dallas stories up front and pushed back the Monmouth-Independence edition. And so the people in the respective communities got two very different front pages with their own local news. And I gotta say, that was a pain in the arse to flip out the stories, but it was well worth it, because I think it helped give each community their own identity and gave their news primacy, which was very important to me and very important to Dave. And I was there as editor from 2001 to 2005, and with Dave's significant blessing, I left to become an editorial writer for the Lewiston Tribune in Idaho. Dave was quite familiar with the Lewiston Tribune and had thoroughly encouraged me, because it is a truly great newspaper. I love the two papers. I've worked with 13 newspapers in my life, and the two greatest have been the Itemizer, Observer, and the Lewiston Morning Tribune. And I had 3.5 wonderful years in Lewiston as an editorial writer and columnist, which is the cushiest job in the world. You never have to use your key to open the front door. You get paid obscenely well, and I even had time to be an adjunct professor at Washington State and teach advanced newspaper editing. But and just it is a middle of the road liberal paper in a very conservative town, and we always did our when we rubbed against the grain, and we always said on the editorial page we have two missions: to save the world and sell newspapers, not necessarily in that order. To me, the moment that sums up the Lewiston Tribune was my first week on the job. I wrote my first editorial. It was about a strip search law in Washington State that I considered unconstitutional. And I wrote the headline on it: "Strip search law blatantly unconstitutional." And Jim Fisher, as you would say, my comrade in calumny, said, no, this is the Lewiston Tribune. You got to write a headline as feisty as your editorial. So we bandied it about, and we ended up with "Right Schmite, shut up and drop your pants." And that pretty much set the tone of the Lewiston Tribune. And then after 3 years, we had a great recession, and the Lewiston Tribune realized they couldn't afford to be full-time editorial writers and columnists, and so I started taking a meandering journey. I was the editor of the South County Spotlight in Scappoose, a crime writer for the Corvallis Gazette-Times, legislative reporter for the Daily Journal of Commerce, for AOL, or as it stands for Almost Online, for a few years, and then another startup called Two Blue Media, and then for the past 5.5 years, I was City Hall reporter for the McMinnville News Register until another, you may have heard about it, another economic downturn this last year. Was unemployed again, but over the years I've become adept to jumping from ice flow to ice flow. So I took a job, freelance job with a paper called Street Roots in Portland. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Street Roots. It is a very unique business model. The paper is sold on the street by people who are experiencing homelessness. It's sold for $1, and every dollar that they get, they keep. And in exchange, Street Roots connects them with all sorts of services, helps them get back on their feet. And through grants and donations, the paper basically runs for free. It doesn't depend on advertising or subscriptions. And so it does very in-depth alternative journalism in the Portland area. So it was a great honor to cover some of the early stages of the pandemic and various issues for Street Roots. But then I heard the disturbing news that the last issue of the Itemizer Observer was on its way to the press, and that there was going to be no more Itemizer Observer, but that current publisher Scott Olson had stepped in at the last minute and bought the paper and saved it. And I thought that I had a lot of sentimental feeling for the Itemizer, and so I offered to write some stories for free. He said, "How much you want to get paid?" I said, "Forget it. It's not worth the accounting at my end for you to pay me per story. I'll just do this out of the goodness of my heart, just to help the paper get some feature stories." And so I did that often enough, and then he said that would you like to come back to the paper at least on a part-time basis and continue to write news and features? And I said, well, yes, but I'd like a regular beat. And he said, what beat would you like to cover? And I said, how about Monmouth? I'd like to cover Monmouth city government, because in the intervening years between my stints at the Itemizer, I got to divorced from Virginia, who was the previous editor of the Itemizer, and I married a local girl, Amy Timshell, of the Monmouth Timshells. And some of you might know them. They've been very active in Polk County Democrats. They have a big farm south of town on Helmet Road. And when I met Amy, I had no idea there was a Polk County connection. I was telling her about my past, and she said, "Oh my goodness, my folks live in Monmouth. They read the paper cover to cover." So I was a bit cocky when I met them. I thought they're going to know me because if they read the paper cover to cover, they know that they've seen my face. I wrote a column for 10 years and had my mugshot on top of page 5. Nope, no idea who I was. They read everything except my column. But they're such a lovely, large, eccentric family. I love writing for the paper. I love covering Monmouth because we see them every Wednesday. We bring them food, so they don't have to go out and grocery shopping. And my mother-in-law always brings out the paper and starts saying, "You're on the front page," and says, and tries to give me a copy. And I keep telling her, I work for the paper. I get free copies of the paper. It's one of the perks. You can keep your copy of the paper. But I really want to support more than the income that the paper provides. I am really committed to helping the Itemizer Observer because it is like I said, I love the paper. I really want to see it continue. And these are very, very hard times. I got laid off, like I said, from the News Register because they just couldn't afford to keep a full-time staff. I think all the reporters now are half-time, supplementing their income as best they can with unemployment and other means. But the survival of community journalism is by no means guaranteed. Just because the paper has been here since the 1870s doesn't mean it's going to be here, in the future decades. And it was on its last leg. It was on its way. The last issue was on its way to the press, and now it is only there's an editor and a full-time reporter, David Hayes, who just got hired, and myself. And those three people are putting out this paper that once had 7 people. We used to have 2 reporters covering Monmouth-Independence. Now it's basically just me. And it's very hard to pick up all the community meetings and all the city councils and school boards and planning commissions. But the fact that it's there at all, the fact that those stories are being covered, that those meetings are being reported, and are being put into some kind of logical perspective is a tribute to the men and women who gravitate towards journalism. That it is rarely about money. We do what we do because we want to serve communities, and that we believe that an informed electorate is the absolute basis for democracy. And I've said I could not be prouder of all that this newspaper has accomplished over the years. In addition to covering 9/11, I will embarrass Dave by saying that we were one of the only newspapers in the country at the outset of the Iraq War. People talk about how gullible the press was back then and how it ate whole cloth the narrative of weapons of mass destruction. Well, not at the Itemizer Observer and not with Dave Weston, who wrote an editorial questioning the validity of that narrative and saying that we need to think twice, 3 times, 4 times before getting involved in a military intervention in Iraq because the case for weapons of mass destruction has just not been made. And I don't think any small newspaper in this country can make that boast that they came out against the Iraq War before it was popular. In fact, it was a very unpopular stand to take at the time. And we took many unpopular stands. We answered a lot of questions and questioned a lot of answers. And I think that is one thing that, if I could change one thing about the current Itemizer Observer, is we don't have editorials anymore. And I think that's a shame. I think that as a newspaper, we should take an editorial stand. I can see why we don't. I can see that this is a very precarious time. And I remember mentioning to Ossie Levine, one of the publishers of the News Register, that the Itemizer doesn't run editorials. And his response was, "Oh, I guess they want to stay in business." Because one of the jokes at the News Register was how often I cost, because I wrote many of the editorials, they would say, "Well, Tom cost us 7 subscriptions today." And I love the fact that a good newspaper is a restaurant that will serve you up what you want the way you want it prepared. That we don't give you the news that you want, we give you the news that you need. And the stories are not always glamorous. I wrote a story about a wastewater, the storm water treatment fee going up in Monmouth, which is not a gripping story, but it needs to be told. And so I think this newspaper is a local institution that has a very, very proud heritage. That is, like I said, I don't think awards are necessarily a benchmark of quality, but if they were, the paper, aside from the awards that I've won, has won many, many awards, and has been recognized nationally. I think one of my favorite moments in journalism was, again, this is a Dave-related story, as most of my moments in journalism seem to be. But one of my heroes growing up, when I first became interested in journalism, was a guy named Nat Hentoff. He wrote a column for the Village Voice, and he was one of the preeminent journalists covering the First Amendment and jazz. Those were his two specialities, jazz and the First Amendment. And he was a man who took his politics a la carte, issue by issue, and you could never tell where he was going to stand, but he always stood firmly on the side of the First Amendment. And as a teenager, I would ride my bike down to Salem to the old Capitol newsstand and pick up the Village Voice and simply read Nat Hentoff. And later, when I was at the Itemizer Observer, I was president of the Oregon chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. And we were doing a nationwide public awareness campaign promoting the importance of the First Amendment and open government, open records, and so forth. And I walked into the newsroom one day, and I still have the while you were out slip, but Dave handed it to me and said, "Do you know a guy named Nat Hentoff in New York City?" And I said, "Oh my God, it's kind of like being a musician and someone saying, do you know some guy named Elvis Presley?" Well, he was a garage band. And so I called the number, and it's Nat Hentoff. It's my boyhood hero. And he wanted to commend me on what we were doing with the Society of Professional Journalists. And then later that year, I went to New York City for the National Convention. And there was a panel on media criticism that Hentoff was on, along with a guy named Wolf. I can't remember his first name now. He writes for Vanity Fair. This last year, he put out during the Trump administration, he put out Michael Wolf. Michael Wolf put out a tell-all book about the Trump administration. And he's a bit of a jackwagon. He's a real jerk as a journalist and as a person. But anyway, some student asked him in this panel, what would you advise? What advice would you give to student journalists? And Michael Wolf said, none. Get out of the field. It's a stink it's a fish that stinks from the head down. There's no redeeming qualities to it. And Nat Hentoff just blew up. He pounded his fist on the desk and he said, "No, damn it. Journalism is still a valuable and noble profession. An example is sitting here right in front of us, Tom Henderson from the Polk County Itemizer Observer in Dallas, Oregon." And he said, he and his staff are doing remarkable things at their little paper, fighting, striking daily blows for, freedom of the press. And he said, they're an example that great journalism comes in the smallest of newspapers. And I just kind of thought that was kind of my, that was my diploma. That was that I had truly arrived at that point. And I owe that, accolade, however, undeserved it may have been on an issue by issue basis. I owe that to the work that I was able to do at the Itemizer Observer. And I always told staff members, two things that I said that you can do as good a work at the Itemizer Observer as you do in the New York Times, because journalism is like so much in life. You get out of it what you put into it. But I'd also remind them that the things that we think are the greatest thing in the newspaper that week are our expose or our in-depth feature, we think that's the most important thing in the paper. But truly what the most important thing in the paper is refrigerator journalism, which is, my mother-in-law who clips out little articles about her grandchildren that puts them on the refrigerator. And the weddings and the birth announcements. And that is a lot of what we do. And it's a large part of what other papers can't do. You can write as good a story as for the Itemizer as you can for the New York Times, but the paper, New York Times, does not produce that level of refrigerator journalism. It doesn't, talk about the people you know on the street. It doesn't it doesn't talk about your friends and family. And that is, one of the great values of what we do at the Itemizer Observer, and continue to do, even, with just a shadow of the staff that the paper used to have. still making sure that the paper is covered to the best of our ability and to the best of local advertising, because the size of a paper and what it can cover is largely determined by the space allowed by retail advertising. And with retail advertising dwindling for obvious reasons, and not just the pandemic, changes in readership and the way people consume news, we don't have what we call the same news hole. News hole is what's left over for news once you have the number of pages and space justified by the advertising. We don't have the news hole that we used to in the print edition, and people aren't reading the print edition as much as they used to. So, but it's the best. We're still doing the best we can do, and I look at it like they're going to have to carry me out of journalism feet first, and that there's a great quote. I actually think it's from the British television series Doctor Who. But I said that it's the best I can do, and and who I am is where I stand, and where I stand is where I fall. And I feel that way about newspapers, is that we're going to keep doing it until we can't do it anymore. And hopefully people in the community will, and especially young people, will continue to read and continue to consume news and realize the importance of journalism, especially in a small community. So with that, I'll quit yammering and see if anyone has any questions they want to ask.
I have a question, Tom. I'm wondering, I agree with you 100% about the fact that journalism is incredibly critical these days, and factual journalism in particular. And so I applaud you and your colleagues for, holding on to that truth. But my question is, obviously, the way to reach the younger folks is online. And do you ever see print journalism going away completely?
Unfortunately, it may well go away completely. I mean, when I was laid off from the Lewiston Tribune, at least 5 people sent me a New Yorker article that said the last newspaper will roll off the press in 2049. So I want to say thank you so much for pointing that out to me. Why don't you give me a nice paper cut and pour lemon juice on it? But it is quite conceivable that print as a medium will go away. I hope that I will be gone by then, but it is the real challenge of journalism on how to make that transition to digital, because it is not just, a lot of people say it's just a change in delivery mechanism. It's just a change in medium. It is not. The thing to remember about the difference between print and online is no one has discovered a way just yet on online to make it pay the sort of revenue that you got from print retail advertising. And without that revenue stream, you can't afford a large number of reporters. You can't have, especially, say, for example, the Washington Post. You can't have thousands of reporters. You can't have bureaus all over the world. The Seattle Times can't have hundreds of newsroom personnel. They're down to a few dozen because they can't afford. That's why we see the massive layoffs in journalism, is because that online doesn't pay like print does, and no one has figured out a way to employ the legions of reporters that print was able to employ. Again, you see it at the Itemizer Observer. This was a paper that before the internet had 7 people on staff. Now it's got 2.5. I don't think I've ever been described as half a person before. It's 6'6", but so that's the real danger, is that you won't have those legions of reporters to vet the news, and and TV, and print is vitally important. Even TV news, print is still the meat on which broadcast feeds. You notice when you listen to a news report, they'll say, according to the Washington Post, according to the Oregonian is reporting. They still get so much of their news from print because print still has the large number of reporters, and that's changing. That is a danger, that we're going to lose large staffs of reporters. That the Itemizer in that sense is a bit of a canary in the coal mine. That we're a foreshadowing of what is happening in journalism. I don't know what.
Well, one of the things that it's occurred to me is I wondered if ever we could get to like kind of an NPR business model for journalism, in the sense for online local papers, because people might be willing to pay for that.
I don't know. I know that I have been buoyed somewhat by the success of Street Roots, the paper that I work for in Portland. I continue to contribute to them from time to time. I'm going to be covering the legislature for them. But the fact that they are able to survive and thrive without being dependent on advertising or subscriptions is remarkable. And they're able to basically circulate the paper for free. They just charge $1 for it, so these people who are homeless can keep the dollar. But and have a sense of worth about what they're doing. I think that's a wonderful business model, and so in public journalism, certainly NPR and OPB have proven that you can get taxpayer money and still create independent journalism. How much that is sustainable at every level of the press, I often say that when people talk about the press, they forget that the press is not CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post. Most of the people who work in the press, most reporters in the world, are working for small papers. They're working for the Itemizer, Observer, the News Register in McMinnville, the Salem Statesman Journal, the Corvallis Gazette Times. These local papers, and I don't know. I am not, I am certainly not a businessman, clearly, but it could be a viable model. I just question whether or not it's a viable model, at every strata of the news media. And we need to have those multiple strata. We need to have, we need NPR, we need, we need, Portland papers, but we also need, like I said, in an ideal world, we would still have a Sun Enterprise covering Monmouth-Independence and an Itemizer Observer covering Dallas. But we need local papers, so I just don't know how, if that's an alternative funding model to reach everywhere where it needs to.
I know that my life would be incomplete without a physical newspaper in front of me for breakfast. I get 2 of them to the house every day, and it's always been for my whole life an important part of starting my day with a paper in front of me. But I get pardon?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. But I think one of the problems you face is eBay and Craigslist and loss of classified advertising to those.
Yeah, that probably is a thing. Craigslist, I would have to say, and and Dave can corroborate this for me, but that Craigslist was probably one of the single biggest blows to community newspapers, that we lost that vital classified advertising. And I know that the loss of legal advertising for some papers has been a devastating blow. But I think more than anything else, those small ads, the classifieds, is we used to have just well, most papers I know don't even have classified sections. They have little lists of classifieds within the body of the paper. They don't have multiple pages. You could fit the classified ads from the McMinnville News Register into one corner of the paper. And I really wish that we could get. It's no use fighting the river on this, but I really wish that more people had the habit of reading newspapers in the morning. And like you said, that their day is not complete. My in-laws read the Statesman Journal and the Polk County Itemizer Observer. My father-in-law gets several Swedish language newspapers. It's there's always. I always joke that whenever we go over there, he's always sitting in his perch at one end of the table doing the Sudoku and the crossword for the day. And it's sad that people have gotten out of that habit. And it's the bread and butter of most community newspapers are people who are 50 and older, because we're the ones that are still have that habit. We're still the ones that read books. And instead of relying on Kindle, we like the tactile feeling of ink on paper. And as a romantic in me, it's like I really hate to see the death of ink on paper, whether it's in a newspaper or a book or a magazine. Like I said, I much prefer reading something that I can touch and feel and have in front of me, flip pages.
Tom,
Questions?
Tom, I'd like to say, I'd like to say this. In your writing, we always talk about being objective, but objectivity is not a possibility. Every decision you make is subjective. The trick in writing and being good about it is to tell the truth and to be fair to all concerned. Try to cover the story from all directions you can. And you have always embodied those things in doing it. You add one other element that is there always in some form or another, but you bring a whole grand scheme to it. That is creativity, bringing it alive, making it really fun for people to see and read and understand. And you add that element to the objectivity, fairness, whatever you want to say about good journalism.
Well, thank you very much. That is, I just want to have you say that because, like I said, you're been a significant figure in my career. I used to tell journalism students at Washington State that your biggest competition is not the competing newspaper, it's not the television, that your biggest competition is the toenail clippers. That people have a million and one things they could be doing other than reading your story. And one of them is clipping their toenails. And so you have to give them a reason to read the story. You have to give them a reason to care about the story, even if it's stormwater fees in Monmouth. You have to make the story come alive. You have to give them a reason to read. You have to give them a reason to read past the paragraph. And so many things falling on our attention being does. And you have to creativity is essential because you have to make people want to read your story. Otherwise, they're going to wander off and trim their toenails.
That's right.
Dave, that was a wonderful tribute. That was just a perfect tribute for Tom. And Tom, I'm afraid our time is up, and I don't know if we have to quit now or not, but I really want to thank you.
Well, thank you, Bonnie. You have been a cherished friend for 30 years now. So I think I remember that first story about the snow that year very, 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 very intimately. It was a bit like being on lockdown. I remember we couldn't hardly leave the paper because the snow was so deep. So,
and my daughter went out and got pictures for you.
Good. And Karen has been a good friend these many years too. And so I will say that right now I am working from what we are calling the Portland Bureau of the Itemizer Observer. My wife Amy and I live in Beaverton, but we are planning on moving to Monmouth within the year to be closer to her family. And so she's just looking for a job that's a bit more lucrative than mine as the Itemizer. But when that happens, we'll be moving to Monmouth.
And Bonnie will have a house for sale.
He's got a.
And the Rotary Club will be resuming meetings when the vaccine comes, and we'd like to invite you to become a member of our club.
Become a member again, you should say, because I was a member of the Monmouth-Independence Rotary in the mid-90s.
Oh, okay.
Becoming a member, this will be resuming my membership.
That would be wonderful.
I just got to say too, I want to extend or add on to Bonnie's thanks. And for I'll just put it really quickly. Something that really spoke to me was the that when you're talking about how newspaper kind of serves as a restaurant, really we provide what we need. But yeah, I just want to just add in that, and I think that's very true. And yeah, well, just want to be respectful of everyone's time here, and really let's give Tom a round of applause for really being able to join us today. And for sure, I as Paul suggested, once we're back in our gatherings as normal, as usual, we can definitely welcome you with open arms in our group. And to resume your membership. And then Bonnie, thank you so much for really being able to have this wonderful program possible for us. And yeah, so we will, so next week, folks, it's going to be our last gathering of the year. And so hopefully you all can come in and join us. And we're going to have a trade talk by our fellow Rotarian, Karen Johnson. So hopefully you all can carve out some time. Hopefully you all can attend then. And if there's nothing else for the good of the order for today, we'll see you next time.
Bonitos.
Bonitos.
Take care, everyone. Thank you again, Tom.
Thank you.